Welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and the name of today's episode is The Past and Future Meet in the Present. This is a commentary on Chapter 7 of Prometheus and Atlas by Jason Reza Jorjani. In this chapter, Jorjani leverages Heidegger and Nietzsche to show us that history is as much about the future as it is about the past. We like to think of history as yesterday's news, but that's not true. History is as much about the future as it is about the past. Nietzsche shows us that there is no such thing as a neutral history. There's no such thing as some objective view of the past, independent of our myths, symbols, values, and illusions. And the same is true for science, as much as people don't want to admit it. Nietzsche says that we should, we're driven by will to power, right? Whereas Schopenhauer talked about the will to life, Nietzsche talked about the will to power. These ideas are not contradictory. The will to power for the sake of life. So we should seek, and we do seek power so that we can live, so that our children can live, so that our people can live. And and because of that, everything we do, including the writing of history, should be attuned to the acquisition of power for the sake of advancing our life. Now, Dasein, Heidegger, being in is what the sign means. Being in the world being that time and place in which what I think, say, and do makes sense, right? So what makes sense in Japan to think, say, and do doesn't necessarily make sense in Afghanistan and doesn't necessarily make sense in San Francisco or Buenos Aires. These are all different worlds where what makes sense is very different. And so we live in these different worlds. And these different worlds give us different relationships to the present and the past and the future. Okay. So we can't talk about the past without talking about the future because they're like two ends of a pole, two sides of the same coin. So without a view toward the future, it's impossible to talk about the past. So you can't do history. You can't talk about the past, write about the past, model the past without a view towards the future, because that is the temporal context in which history takes place. The creation of history takes place, past, present, and future. And so basically, there are three different types of history: monumental, antiquarian, and critical. Antiquarian histories are what you might consider conservative histories. These are histories that talk about the good old days, right? So our ancestors, our people, our nation, our religion, whatever it is, our group was good in the past. And so we need to preserve that goodness and carry it forward, right? Because there's a sense that everything is constantly changing and that we're little by little separating ourselves from that goodness. Things are going to change. So we need to preserve the past, what's old, what's true, what's good as much as possible. Now, this can be a good thing, right? Because, some people think there are great things about the past, right? That we can emulate and preserve. But antiquarian history runs a risk, right? That risk being a kind of fatalism, right? So we're going from this glorious past and slowly sliding into a dark future. So we need to preserve as much as of the past and the old ways and traditions as we can, because defeat is inevitable, but we can at least do our best to slow it down. We can be men among the ruins, right? Making our last stand toward against an inevitable defeat. And that's the risk of antiquarian history, right? Where it can turn us into traditionalists with a capital T. And in the worst version of this, um, these traditionalists might actually advocate the acceleration of this decline so that everything can bottom out and then start all over in a new golden age, which in my view is total bullshit, right? Um, there are psychos who actually think that, if we accelerate the horrible things in the world and the wars and the destruction, that Jesus will come back sooner, or the 12th Imam will come out of the well, or Krishna will come back, or whatever. Like, this is total insanity, right? So that's the one of the consequences of an antiquarian history, in the extreme negative sense, right? Of consequence. But antiquarian history does have its benefits, but again, it also has that potential downfall. Then you have critical history. Critical history looks at the past as something bad, as something not glorious, as something very different from what the antiquarians will say it is. And this can be good, right? In some sense, right? If your culture has, in your people, your religion, your nation, whatever it is, your family has certain traditions or world or viewpoints that are bad, harmful, dangerous. Having a critical view of history can do a lot to deconstruct those bad traditions and bad myths, and thus liberate ourselves from them. Um, but critical history also has negative side, right? So you can be too critical. You can tear down all the statues, right? But not replace them with something else, right? And so critical history can quickly turn it into some form of nihilism, where you criticize the past religion, you criticize the past national heroes, you criticize the past traditions, but and you deconstruct them and you free yourself from them, but then you don't replace it with anything else, and so you're left with nothing, nothing to inspire you, and lo and behold, nothing to defend. And then you get, next thing you know, the barbarians are at the gates and they take over, right? So this is the drawback of a critical history, that it's actually can become a defeatist history that undermines the survival and progress of your people. But Nietzsche advocates monumental history, right? And I like this term because monuments, right? We have monuments, for our ancestors, our great founders. Monumental history is about a future which is progressive, which is strong, which is vibrant. Um, and so the past is described in ways which point us to a better future. So, our ancestors weren't perfect. Our, the religion may have had some bad times, but hey, you know what? All in all, it's good, it's noble, it's worthy of, commitment and loyalty, and it is what will lead us into a bright and better future. And so, um, that's what monumental history is all about. It's about envisioning a bright and better future, whether that's subconsciously or consciously, and describing the past in a way that shows that that past was the beginning of an, a better tomorrow, right? An example of a monumental history would be the Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible, whether you're talking about the Torah, the prophets, or the writings. Um, this is the monumental history of the Jewish people, right? And you can read the Hebrew scriptures and see, how different people, prophets, and kings made really big mistakes. But at the end of the day, the sum total is good. Now, I don't care if you're an atheist, I don't care if you're a monotheist, or I don't care if you're a polytheist like me, okay? I don't care what your religion is or what you think about the Bible, okay? The fact of the matter is, the Tanakh is the monumental history of the Jewish people. And even though the majority of the people in Israel are secular, we cannot deny that this monumental history has played a role in the existence of the current Jewish state. So, the Jews are driven out of their land in 70 AD by the Romans, right? They had an unsuccessful revolt, and they get scattered, right? A lot of them go to Europe, and a lot of them go to the Middle East. Um, and there's a diaspora of different Jewish communities and ethnicities, the Ashkenazim, the Sephardim, the Mizrahi, you name it, right? Um, and but through it all, you have this monumental history, right, that speaks of these Northwest Semitic tribes, the Hebrews, right, who were once slaves, but they're God's chosen people, and he gets them out of slavery. He promises them this slab of land, and he says, "You're my people, and you have a mission. And it's to make the world a better place. And if you follow me, I'm going to help you out. If you don't, I'm going to leave you to your own consequences. But at the end of the day, you're my people, and you're on the side of good." And so, for almost 2,000 years, the Jews are out of their homeland, and they pass on this monumental history. This monumental history becomes the basis of their culture, because they were always ghettoized and segregated, and that sort of thing. Um, and lo and behold, you know, in the last century, these people resurrect a dead nation and resurrect a dead language, right? Biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew are not the same, but modern Hebrew is an attempt at a resurrection. It's a reconstruction of a Hebrew language, right? Um, the grammar with biblical Hebrew is very different, but still, it is Hebrew. And so they resurrect a nation, they resurrect a language, and here you have modern Israel. And you wouldn't have the existence of modern Israel without the existence of this monumental history, which frames the Jewish past on average as good and virtuous, um, on average, because again, the Tanakh is very critical of the Jewish people and the mistakes they make in the ancient past. But again, on average, they tend to trend on the side of the good. They have a mission in a very specific piece of land as their operating base, right? And so that monumental history, irregardless of whether it is literally true or not, that is not the point. Okay, there are obviously parts of Tanakh which are historical, and there are parts of the Tanakh which are ahistorical. But again, that's not the point. The point is that it's a monumental history. It's geared to a certain end, the end being Jewish people living on a specific piece of land in a very Jewish way. That's the key. Because remember, uh, we still have Jews, right? But we don't have Hittites. We don't have Visigoths. We don't have Vandals. Okay. We don't have, you know, you name it, a host of other ethnicities that existed in the past and no longer exist. But we do have Jews. And the reason why they've been able to preserve for so long without abandoning their religion, and ultimately, in the case of Israel, uh, maintaining some form of their language, is because of this monumental history. Egyptians, it would appear, they didn't have this kind of history. And Egyptians are still around today. You can go to Egypt, and those people are descendant of the pharaohs, but they don't speak the language of the pharaohs. They don't have the religion of the pharaohs, right? They speak Arabic, and they're Muslim, or Christian, right? And before that, they were all Christian. Then they spoke Coptic, which is a version of Egyptian. But uh, the the ability for the Jewish people to maintain their identity and their traditions and their homeland, arguably, is in large part because of this monumental history, irregardless of what you think about God. Okay, I don't care, and I don't care what you think about Israel either. Okay, antiquarian history. Okay, Make America Great Again is a perfect example of an antiquarian history in one line, right? The idea is that America was great, America is not great today, and we need to make it great again, right? We need to go back to the level of greatness we once had, right? And that could be a positive thing if you say that, look, there was a time, after the Second World War where America was on top, everything was, baseball and apple pie, and life was good for most people, let's say, or some people, and we need to get back to that, right? Um, but again, this antiquarian view is kind of dangerous, right? Because here you have a president that says, make America great again. If he can't make it great again, will it ever be great again? It also assumes that America is not great now. So, this can be complicated, right? And same thing with monumental history, right? Your monumental history may get in the way of other people's monumental history, and clashes can happen. I don't care what you think about Trump. This is not a political post, but the antiquarian attitude is definitely at home in MAGA. And then you have critical history, right? Uh, Here's an example of critical history, or the critical view toward history. Mexico's President Sheinbaum, right? She refused to invite the Spanish king to her inauguration. For those who don't know, in Spanish speaking America, it's a tradition for the Spanish king um, to attend the inauguration of various presidents, right? Because Latin America and Iberia, along with the Philippines, are part of a historical community rooted in an old empire where the sun never set. That's right. The first empire ever on earth where the sun never set was the Spanish Empire. And that term was actually coined by Spaniards before the English co-opted it. And this is an example of critical history, right? Where you look at all the sins of the past and accentuate those. So in this case, the sins of the Spanish, right? Um, in their destruction of a civilization, essentially, or a near total destruction of a civilization. Now, um, again, this can be positive, right? In the sense of when you have a mestizo population, there may be a temptation to uh, over valorize the castizo and the white, right, at the expense of the mestizo and the Indian, right? Essentially racism, right? And so, if you have a critical view of the Spanish, that kind of takes the shine off European identity, um, especially as it exists among the highest classes, which are predominantly European descent. Scheinbaum herself, all four of her grandparents come from Eastern Europe. Okay. Um, which is interesting, right? All four of her grandparents come from Eastern Europe, but she's really mad about the conquest, as if she's not a part of it somehow. The thing about it is okay. So in one sense, a critical view of the Spanish Empire can be a helpful thing, especially if you have if you're very proud of your Indian roots. But in another way, again, it can lead to nihilism, right? So you want Spain to apologize for the empire? Why? The Spanish people who are alive in Spain today are descendants of the people that did not cross the ocean and effectuate the conquest, right? The people in Spain alive today, their ancestors did not get on the boats. They did not fight the battles. They did not start the colonies and build the settlements. Okay, you know who did that? My ancestors did. And if you're Mexican, your ancestors did too. Okay, I'm Puerto Rican, okay? But I'm very proud of my mestizo heritage, both sides, okay? I'm proud of the Taino and I'm very proud of the Spanish as well, okay? And when you know, talk about the Spanish Empire and denigrate it, you're denigrating half of who you are. You cannot reduce the Mexican or the Puerto Rican to the indigenous without framing yourself and your people as perpetual victims of the European, whether it be directly from Europe in the case of the Spanish or indirectly from North America in the case of the Americans, right? And so Scheinbaum's rhetoric, which she inherited from her predecessor Obrador, is the kind of rhetoric that frames Mexico as the perpetual victim of European powers, you know, and that might not be a positive thing. And I think in the long run, it's actually detrimental. Okay. For Mexico and Puerto Rico, which are predominantly mestizo populations, in Puerto Rico are arguably Pardo or mulatto as well, because we have a very strong African component to our culture and gene pool. Um, to frame yourself as a perpetual victim is not the kind of thing you want to do if you want to exceed your current boundaries with regards to progress and innovation. And framing yourself as a perpetual victim is not the kind of thing that inspires the youth to dream and be creative and have an internal locus of control and a belief in themselves, right? Um, that's the negative side of a critical history, right? It causes people to hate themselves, right? Because if you're Mexican and you're Puerto Rican and you hate the Spanish, you hate yourself because you are just as much Spanish as you are an Indian. Okay, so I reject this kind of viewpoint. And just so you know, I lived in Mexico for 2 years as an adult in the state of Nuevo León. I don't have a single Mexican family member, but I love Mexico, right? I really do love Mexico. I'm actually more familiar with Mexican culture than I am Puerto Rican culture because I grew up in Los Angeles. So I'm coming from a place of love when I say this. I reject the concept of the malinchista or the malinche, right? When you talk about the wife of Hernan Cortez, who was his translator, right? A woman who spoke at least one Mayan language and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and was able to act as a translator and marry Cortez. And they had a son who became a knight, by the way, and who was a page to the Holy Roman Emperor back in Spain. Um, you know, you can't denigrate her without denigrating yourself, right? And this idea where that Mexicans or other Latin Americans who have an affinity for Europe or an affinity for North America, for that matter, are malinchistas, that there's some kind of Uncle Tom sellout. This is again the kind of like self torturing mentality that keeps people behind. Because what it says is progress and strength belong to your former enemies, as opposed to progress and strength belonging to your ancestors and yourself. Okay. So I'm not a fan of this kind of viewpoint, and that's why I'm not a fan of critical history vis-a-vis the United States or Latin America. But Heidegger taught us that time, our being is bound in time, and how we view time determines how we view our very being. And so this brings me to a thought experiment by Bernardo Kastrup. I'll put the link in the description, where he describes how, if you think about it, if you stop right now and think about your past, any time in your life, the past has always been a mental experience, right? The past has always been a mental experience right now, right? If I stop right now and think of my high school years or my childhood, the past is is something I construct mentally and experience now. Similarly, the future is something that I imagine now. You're only ever in the present moment. In the past, in some sense, is a mental construct that you experience in the present, just as the future is a mental construct that you experience now. So, in a very real sense, the past and the future are with us now. Okay, I'm going to put the link in the description so you can watch it on your own. Okay, then we have the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics. There's a wonderful video by Sabine Hossenfelder that describes this interpretation of quantum mechanics. I'm not a physicist, I'm not a scientist, but essentially the idea is this. If you shoot a particle, through two slits, and it, hits one slit, right? But, according to the Copenhagen interpretation, it goes through both slits. But it when you measure it, it only looks as if it went through one or something like that. Okay. According to transactional theory of quantum mechanics, right? You shoot the particle, it goes through the two slits, um, it hits the sensor, whatever, and then the sensor shoots a wave back, So you have the wave function going from the past and the future, but then you have another wave function going from the future and the past. And these things kind of merge and cancel each other out, right? So whatever happened in the future, that kind of wave is sent back into the past, and again it hits the emitter, and again these two wave functions cancel each other out little by little until you get the one event that happened in the future. Okay, watch the video. That's my layman's interpretation. It's been described like a handshake, right? That the measurement problem is in quantum mechanics is has a solution in these two wave functions, one from the past and one from the future, kind of meeting and averaging out into a single result, right? That happened in the future. Okay, and that's kind of like a handshake, and so it's very weird, but supposedly it's very rational according to the math and the science and all that good stuff. And so that brings me to a metaphysics of time. Okay. Now, Bernardo Kastrup gives us a phenomenology of time. Phenomenology, as opposed to metaphysics, is about how things appear, right? It's not about what things are, right? It doesn't matter if the world is mental, material, or from a third substance that emits the mental and the material, whatever, or computational for that matter, whatever your metaphysics is, it has nothing to do with phenomenology. Phenomenology is about the world as it appears, as it is experienced. And so Kastrup's phenomenology of time is one in which the only thing that exists, the only time that exists is the present, and the past and the future exist simultaneously as our own mental abstraction, okay, right now. Okay, they exist. There's a past and there's a future, but these are mental abstractions that we create and experience now. Okay, and again, with the whole transactional theory of quantum mechanics, you know, basically the collapse of the wave function happens because the you have the photon coming from the emitter, but then the sensor also sends a wave into the past, carrying the information of the result, and somehow this averages out with the possibilities of that result into the actual result. And so that's the transactional theory of quantum mechanics. So if we were to kind of use that um, as an analogy for the macro, okay, one way we can imagine time is this. There is a past, there's a present, and there's a future. And what the present is the past and the future crashing into each other. Okay, so this is a metaphysics of time. Again, you don't have to believe it's true, but like all metaphysical theories, it's a lens you can use, right? Different metaphysical theories, just like different scientific theories, reveal different aspects of reality, right? And so in this metaphysics of time, what is the present? The present is the crashing together of the past and the future. Okay. So you can see this, for example, in modern day Japan. To your right is a Shinto priest. He is dressed in the clothing of the Heian period, which was 1,000 years ago, 1,300 to 1,000 years ago, right? He's reading prayers in a liturgical language, an ancient form of Japanese, which is no longer spoken and nobody understands, but is an ancestor to modern Japanese, right? And what is he doing? He is blessing an F-35, okay? One of the most advanced fighter jets ever, right? So, so you have this again, the past and the future crashing into each other in that moment. You also have this example of a jinja, a Shinto shrine, where a priest like this would work, right? Again, the architecture is from the Heian period. The worldview is also equally ancient, but it exists in the midst of these buildings, right? So basically, the past exists with us now in the form of relics and records, and the future exists with us now in the form of novelty, because that novelty will become the relics and records of a past in the future, will it not? those buildings which you see behind the shrine um, will be antiques. They'll be tourist attractions. Look at it 1,000 years from now, if they're still standing. Whoa, look at what they built 1,000 years ago. How primitive or how great. Um, that shrine may or may not exist, right? It may be a supermarket, it may be a church, it may be a mosque. Who knows? But we see the future and the past crashing together in these two images. Here's another example, right? Geisha. Um, Geisha styles kind of became standardized in the 1800s, in the middle 1800s. So it's not quite as old as the style of the Shinto priest. It's a 200-year-old fashion. And here these women, they're riding the bullet train, right? They're probably looking at their cell phones, reading X. Um, Similarly, you have the sumo wrestler, right, with his earbuds, in his very traditional clothing, and there's a girl, dressed very modern with her headphones, and they're in the subways, in a train, right? So again, in these images, you have the future and the past crashing together, because that train may exist in the future in a museum. Um, the bullet train may exist in the future as a relic piece in a museum, but will the style of the geisha exist? Will sumo wrestling exist? We don't know. But sumo wrestling and the geisha come from the past, right? So these things are crashing into each other, creating this beauty, this present moment. Okay. So now to leverage what we learned about monumental, antiquarian, and critical histories, we can imagine that there are multiple pasts and multiple futures crashing into each other. Okay, you have a monumental past, an antiquarian past, and a critical past, right? The monumental past is the past was noble and was the beginning of something better, right? Antiquarian past is the history is the past was good and we're sliding from it little by little. And the critical past is like the past was really bad, and we need to do better. Um, and these three versions of the past lead to progressive, conservative, and regressive futures. Okay. Um, Progressive, I mean, these are all subjective terms, right? An Islamic fundamentalist would consider the return of the caliphate as something very progressive, right? I would not. Um, but in order to have an Islamic caliphate in the future, what do you need? You need to look at the Islamic past, especially in the time of the Prophet, the companions and the companions of the companions, as something glorious and noble that we need to return to and are destined to return to, right? Just like the Jewish people, right? What is it during Passover? What do they always say? Next time in Jerusalem, right? Well, you say that for almost 2,000 years, and guess what? Eventually, you do celebrate Passover in Jerusalem, right? Um, Antiquarian pasts, lead to conservative futures, right? A gradual decline, and critical pasts, I would argue, lead to regressive futures, right? When you denigrate your people, when you denigrate your nation, when you denigrate your religion, and you don't replace it with anything better, you're left with nothing. And once again, it's going to be filled by something, is it not? And it's going to be filled by something uh, you will not like, something very uh, different from what you are and very destructive of what you come from, right? And so what I'm saying in this model is that you can have different versions of the past, different versions of the future crashing together, creating the present moment. And in that case, the historian's job is to take the relics and records of the pasts which are with us and construct something monumental so as to orient a people to a progressive future. Okay. And this has to be done in order to have that progressive future, because a monumental history is what you need in order to inspire the young generation to be creative, to have hope, right? Um, and make the necessary sacrifices, if need be, to create a better world, right? But if you denigrate your ancestors and you denigrate your past traditions and you denigrate everything that came before you, then what's to hope, right? If everything's just getting worse, if everything was bad in the past and we come from the bad, what's to make us think the future could ever be brighter, right? And I mean, this really does work, right? If you look at Islamic fundamentalism, you know, the Arab and Muslim, cultures of the MENA were under European domination, and people started to ask the question, like, hey, we used to have an empire, like extended from Spain to Indonesia. Like, why aren't we as great and glorious as we were before? And the fundamentalists said, well, because we've strayed, right, from the path of the prophet, the companions, and the companions of the companions. And if we go back to that, we'll be great again, right? And did that monumental history of the past work? Yeah, it did. It succeeded, right? That's why Afghanistan is the way it is, unfortunately. That is why Iran currently is the way it is, unfortunately, right? Because those fundamentalists created a monumental history of the Islamic past, which inspired and justified the sacrifices needed in to create the present condition. Okay. Um, and look at Europe, okay? Europe constantly denigrating itself, constantly navel gazing about how bad they were during the colonial times and during World War II and all this stuff. And what do? They say, you know, they abandon their traditional religion, Christianity, without replacing it with anything else, right? They devalue their ancestors, which means they devalue themselves. And so they say, hey, everyone, come on in, right? Everyone from the Middle East, come on in. We were wrong to fight the Crusades. What were we thinking? Come on in. It's your turn. You know, essentially, that's what happens when you create an overly critical history, okay, of yourself, is that you don't keep the barbarians from storming the gates. You invite them in, whoever those barbarians are, okay? And antiquarian history is better, but ultimately leads to the same place, okay? And so this works. I think this model works, right? And so really, if you think about it, the job of the historian is a magical one in some sense, right? You're taking relics and records and you're creating models of the past for a goal, right? Now you can write a critical history. So in doing it in a good way, that's part of a larger monumental history. So let's say in Iran, God willing, this revolution actually happens, and they can throw off the yoke of the mullahs, and have freedom and be like they were in the 70s, right? Um, they could have a critical history of Islam. They can have a critical history at the very least of the current government, right? And that would help disabuse the minds of the youth from ever trying to recreate those conditions, right? But that critical history of Islam, or the critical history of the Islamic Republic, would have to be a subset of a much larger monumental history that valorizes the ancient Iranian heritage, right? That even valorizes the Islamic Golden Age, right? Which not coincidentally happened in former Sassanid Empire and the former westernmost province of the Roman Empire, Iberia, right? Interesting how the Islamic Golden Age happened in the oldest Roman province outside of Italy, right? Which was Hispania, and then also in Sassanid, former Sassanid Empire, the heartland of which was, Iraq and Iran. It didn't happen in the Arabian Peninsula. It didn't happen in North Africa. It didn't happen in Central Asia. It happened in former Roman Empire, former Sassanid Empire. Um, but that critical history of the Islamic past would have to be, again, a subset of a larger monumental history of Iran, um, as the great Promethean culture that it is. And Jorjani has done a lot of work in that regard. But basically, what I'm saying is that history matters, right? And we have to, again, going back to this book, going back to Prometheus, right? When we realize that models and theories are tools, and we realize that history itself is a tool, and history writing itself is a craft. Prometheus, remember the Titan of forethought. We need to recognize that we have to write history with a sense of forethought, oriented toward a future which we find desirable, and that being a future for me, which is progressive, which is attuned to human flourishing, human beings fully actualizing themselves, being as creative as they possibly can be, as free as they possibly can be. So if you're like me, who am a liberal, who believes that the role of the state is to secure the rights of the individual, to secure the freedom and autonomy of the individual, so that they're free to dream and create and build better realities. Okay. Um, then you have to write a monumental history that frames your religious past or your national past in a way that shows its beginnings and its middle is geared toward that end and has always been so, even if you have strayed from the paths occasionally, right? Because remember, in the Tanakh, the Jewish people, they have this special mission from God to carry his name to the nations. And this is their monumental history. And lo and behold, planet Earth right now, the vast majority of people, being they Christian or Muslim, worship the Jewish God. This stuff works, okay? Monumental history is something that is very valuable. Also, I haven't shown this in these slides, but Yasukuni Shrine in Japan has a war museum, and it's about World War II, and it shows the Japanese viewpoint of World War II. Do they flagellate themselves? Do they cry mea culpa, mea culpa? No. What they do is they write a monumental history of World War II. Sure, a war which they lost, but one which they fought for noble reasons, and which actually, during their empire, as short lived as it was, actually furthered the technological development of countries like Korea and Taiwan and even Japan. Okay, and even China. Okay, now every successful country, right? Every successful ideology that's in power right now is only in power because at some point people wrote a monumental history about that nation and its ideology or its religion. Okay. So this is something we all can do, and we all do, if we're successful. Speaking of nations and as people, as individuals. So this isn't a self-help channel by any means, but if you want to go there, you can look at your own life where you are right now and ask yourself, how have you been interpreting the events of your past, right? Um, do you look at the losses as losses, or do you look at them as learning opportunities? Do you see yourself headed to a brighter future? Well, if you do, you have to tell the story of your past in such a way that almost prefigures this, and foresees and uh, this future that you're striving for, right? If you look at your past as something, hopelessly dark and cruel and full of defeat, and well, guess what? I mean, you're not going to have a bright future, okay? And that's true for families, that's true for ethnicities, nations, religions, you name it, okay? So that's my metaphysics of the past and the future and the present, my metaphysics of time, right? Ultimately, we exist in the present. We've only ever existed in the present, And what you have are competing pasts and competing futures crashing into each other and creating this present moment. In order for a nation or people to have a positive future, a progressive future, one tuned to self actualization, they have to consciously write history in a way which prefigures that future. If they write an overly critical history, which denigrates the past, which denigrates their ancestors, which denigrates their former leaders, their former religions and ideologies, they are assured to submit in the future to some other, which does not have those views about itself. Okay, so that's it for today. Um, Relics and records. Okay, that's what history is made of, right? Relics and records, and we need to assemble them in a way that's sturdy, um, and that will endure uh, toward a better future, right? This isn't to say anything goes, right? Because you can create something with Legos which is up, upward, but very flimsy and imbalanced, and it just crashes down, right? This doesn't mean you can create any future you want or any past you want, but it does mean that the vision of the past we create by our assembling of relics in records in different patterns and in arrays, um, does have an effect on our future, because that is very much a prefiguring of our future. And maybe I'll do a future video of how the Maya understood this as well. But at the end of the day, this is all about consciousness, isn't it? And that is not classified. Your consciousness is not classified. Learn how to study your own mind, your own subjective experience, your own attitudes about time. Do you have a linear view of time? Do you have a cyclical view of time? I've just provided you a model of time that is neither linear or cyclical, right? And that really, if you use this lens, you can kind of have a cool experience, um, the trip to Japan or Europe for that matter, or anywhere else, your own hometown, right? The present condition of your hometown is a creative, like it's this explosion that happens when the future and the past, crash into each other, and more specifically, multiple pasts and multiple futures. Um, and the question is, which past are you going to choose for the sake of which future? Okay. So with that, I remind you, consciousness is not classified. Good night.